5 ships. That's how many oil tankers moved through the Strait of Hormuz in a single day last week, on a route that used to carry more than 100 ships every 24 hours before this war started. 5. And here's what should terrify every government from Washington to Tokyo. Iran didn't need a single warship to make that happen. It didn't need to win a naval battle. It didn't even need to keep the strait technically closed. All it needed to do was make every insurance company, every shipping captain, and every oil trader afraid enough to stay away. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly how a country that lost its supreme leader in a single morning of airstrikes, a country whose air defenses were shredded, a country that could not stop a joint US-Israeli bombing campaign from reaching its capital, somehow ended up holding more leverage over the global economy 4 months later than it had before the war even started. This is the story of how you lose a war and still win the choke point. To understand where we are right now, you have to go back to February 28, 2026, the day everything changed. That morning, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury, hitting military facilities, nuclear sites, and senior leadership targets across the country simultaneously. Within hours, Israeli and American intelligence had done something that would have sounded like fiction a year earlier. They killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a strike on his residential compound in Tehran. Using intelligence the CIA had reportedly been building for months, Khamenei's death was confirmed by the Iranian government on March 1st, after Israeli strikes aimed at high-ranking Iranian officials hit his residence directly. He had ruled Iran for 36 years. He had no officially appointed successor, because the post of deputy supreme leader had been abolished decades earlier. Within days, Iran's assembly of experts scrambled to appoint his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new supreme leader, a succession so hurried that questions about legitimacy and internal cohesion inside the regime persist to this day. Iran's response to losing its leader was not surrender. It was escalation across every front it had access to, and the front it leaned on hardest was water. On March 4th, Iranian officials declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, threatening to attack any vessel that attempted to pass, warning that the ships of anyone who tried would be set ablaze by the Revolutionary Guard. This was not an empty threat. The Revolutionary Guard's navy began boarding and attacking merchant vessels, laying naval mines across shipping lanes, and jamming GPS signals so aggressively that captains couldn't trust their own navigation systems. The result was immediate and brutal for global trade. Before the war, roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas moved through this 121-mile-wide gap between Iran and Oman. Within weeks of the closure, tanker traffic didn't just slow down. It collapsed to almost nothing, and by one estimate, more than 2,000 ships and 20,000 mariners found themselves effectively stranded in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. Washington responded by squeezing back. From mid-April through late May, the United States imposed its own counter-blockade on Iranian ports, intercepting ships trying to enter or exit Iranian coastal waters, while simultaneously insisting that it was not blocking the strait itself or anyone else. Iran, in turn, kept insisting the opposite was true, that the waterway remained closed to any vessel it deemed hostile, with occasional hand-picked exceptions for ships from countries it considered friendly. For nearly 3 months, this is what the Strait of Hormuz looked like. Two competing claims about who controlled it, backed by mines nobody could fully account for, and a global economy quietly bleeding money every single day the standoff continued. The turning point, or what was supposed to be the turning point, came on June 17th when President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding that both sides described as the end of the 3-month war. The deal was built around a 60-day negotiating window. Under its terms, Iran agreed to allow commercial vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz with no charge for those 60 days, after which future administration and maritime services in the strait would be determined by Iran, working alongside Oman and other regional partners. In exchange, the United States lifted its own blockade on Iranian ports and coastal waters, and Iranian oil, now free of the sanctions that had been reimposed during the war, was cleared to move again. The agreement even included a proposed $300 billion fund for Iranian reconstruction, to be worked out with regional partners inside that same 60-day window. For about 72 hours, it looked like it might actually hold. Then it didn't. Just 2 days after Trump announced a renewed ceasefire covering Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel continued conducting strikes in southern Lebanon anyway, and Iran responded by declaring the strait closed again, calling the continued Lebanon strikes a direct violation of the broader agreement, a claim the U.S. military immediately denied. This is the pattern that has defined the last 2 weeks of this story, and it's the pattern that makes this so different from a normal ceasefire collapse. It isn't one clean break, it's dozens of small ruptures, each one publicly disputed by both sides, each one measured differently depending on whose numbers you trust. and the numbers really do not agree. Iran's government has repeatedly told its own state media that shipping through the strait is operating normally. The Pentagon's Central Command has repeatedly said the opposite of whatever Tehran claims at any given moment, insisting traffic is flowing and pointing to specific ship counts as proof. Independent tracking services caught in the middle have reported wildly different figures depending on the week, ranging from a 2-month traffic high of roughly 25 transits on the best days immediately after the June 17th signing, down to what one open-source intelligence tracker described as traffic collapsing to a fraction of pre-war levels, with days registering close to zero tanker transits at all. Meanwhile, US Energy Secretary Chris Wright confirmed at one point that roughly 20 million barrels of oil had exited the strait in a single 24-hour period, a genuine record, even as the number of individual vessels making that journey stayed at a third of what it used to be, suggesting bigger ships carrying more cargo rather than any real return to normal shipping volume. Every one of these numbers is technically true. None of them tells you the same story. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because this is the part most coverage gets slightly wrong. The popular narrative is that Iran wants to charge tolls and everyone in the region is quietly going along with it. That is not quite what's happening. What's actually happening is a split screen in public. Iran has made no secret of its intentions. In May, Iran proposed taking control of wider parts of the strait, floated the idea of a new body to manage it, and has reportedly been developing a tiered system that would let ships from specific countries use the waterway, sometimes only in exchange for a fee, Iranian officials have kept hinting publicly and repeatedly that once the 60-day free transit window closes, some form of service charge is coming back. As one financial strategist told Newsweek recently, even the mere possibility of a reintroduced fee is enough to keep every shipping company in the region on edge, because nobody wants to be the test case for what Iran does next. But Oman, the country everyone assumes is quietly cooperating with this plan, has said the opposite in public and said it clearly. Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Basaidi, stated directly that Oman does not support imposing transit fees on ships, calling the practice internationally forbidden and insisting his country is abiding by international maritime rules. That is not the language of a quiet accomplice. That is a direct, on-the-record rejection of the toll idea, coming from the one country whose cooperation Iran would need most to make any fee system stick, since much of the strait's navigable water sits inside Omani as well as Iranian territorial waters. And yet, at the very same time, other reporting confirms that Oman and Iran have been in active, ongoing discussions about exactly this kind of arrangement, quietly exploring what service-related fees for commercial vessels might look like, even as Oman's own foreign minister was denying support for tolls specifically. That's the real story here. It's not Oman agrees with Iran. It's Oman is being pulled into a negotiation it doesn't want to be blamed for, caught between its decades-old role as the region's trusted neutral mediator and the reality that it shares a coastline, and therefore shares leverage, over the one waterway everyone else depends on. The United States, for its part, has drawn a hard line rhetorically. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has publicly said Oman has dismissed the idea of charging vessels passing through the strait, and a joint statement from regional foreign ministers explicitly reaffirmed that free, unconditional, and unrestricted navigation, including the right of transit passage guaranteed under international law, remains essential to both regional and global security. That statement also made a point of noting that lasting peace in the region requires dealing with the full range of Iranian threats, its ballistic missiles, its drone programs, and its support for regional proxy forces, not just the question of who gets to toll a shipping lane. Whether that public pressure changes what happens after the 60-day window closes is, as of this recording, still an open question. If you want to see exactly how confident Iran currently feels, you don't need to look at its military posture. You need to look at how it treats an offer of help. In late June, French President Emmanuel Macron met with Sultan Haytham bin Tariq of Oman ahead of high-level diplomatic talks in Paris. Following that meeting, Oman and France issued a joint statement calling for free, unconditional, and unrestricted navigation through the strait, and announced they had agreed to work collaboratively with all stakeholders to support freedom of navigation and to conduct joint demining operations in the waterway. On paper, this is about as uncontroversial as international diplomacy gets. Two nations, one of them a permanent Security Council member, offering to help clear naval mines from a waterway that a fifth of the world's energy supply depends on. Iran's response was immediate, and it was not aimed at the mines. It was aimed at the idea that anyone besides Iran gets a say. An Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister, Qasem Garibati, posted publicly that under the interim deal signed with the United States, demining in the strait is carried out solely by Iran and by no other country, and warned France against what he called provocations. Think about what that statement actually accomplishes. Iran didn't need to threaten France militarily. It didn't need to escalate. It simply pointed to a piece of paper, an interim agreement negotiated bilaterally with Washington, and used it to tell one of Europe's most powerful nations to stay out of a waterway that international law generally treats as belonging to no single country. That is not the posture of a nation that just lost its top religious and political leader to a foreign airstrike for months earlier. That is the posture of a nation that believes it has already won the argument over who gets to decide what happens in these waters, regardless of what international law says about free passage through what's classified as an international strait. Now let's talk about the week that should have been the lead story on every network, and somehow got buried under the toll dispute. It started on a Thursday in late June, when Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps hit a Singapore-flagged cargo ship called the Ever Lovely with a one-way attack drone as the vessel exited the strait along the Omani coast, on a route that American forces had specifically cleared of Iranian mines beforehand. Taiwan's Evergreen Marine, which owns the vessel, confirmed the ship was struck by an unknown object while following a route recommended by the British Maritime Trade Agency UKMTO close to Oman, sustaining damage to its bridge windows, though the crew, vessel, and cargo were reported safe. Two separate American officials confirmed to major outlets that Iran had fired on the ship, with one source specifying the weapon as an URG drone. President Trump posted that a drone had struck the ship's upper deck and that U.S. forces had shot down 3 additional drones targeting the same convoy, calling the whole episode a foolish violation of the ceasefire agreement. Washington did not just complain about it. Central Command launched retaliatory strikes on Friday against Iranian missile and drone storage sites along the coast, along with coastal radar installations, saying its aircraft targeted these locations directly in response to what it called continued Iranian aggression against commercial shipping. Iran was, in CENTCOM's own words, given a chance to honor the ceasefire and elected not to. If you think that was the end of it, it wasn't. The very next day, a second vessel was hit. CENTCOM said Iranian forces launched another one-way attack drone that struck the Panama-flagged tanker Kiku early Saturday morning as it carried more than 2 million barrels of crude oil near the strait, prompting a second wave of American strikes targeting Iranian surveillance infrastructure, communications systems, air defenses, drone storage, and mine-laying capability. Iran did not absorb that second round of strikes quietly either. Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched drones and missiles directly at the U.S. Fifth Fleet's naval base in Bahrain and at the Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, a direct strike on American military infrastructure hosted by 2 Gulf allies, marking one of the most serious escalations since the June 17 ceasefire was signed. For a few tense hours, this stopped looking like a shipping dispute and started looking like the war restarting in real time, missile for missile, base for base. Iran's Parliamentary National Security Chief, Ibrahim Azizi, went on social media to insist this wasn't a ceasefire violation at all, framing it instead as what he called ceasefire management, and warning the United States not to mistake Iranian control of the strait for an invitation to escalate. Both sides ultimately agreed to stand down by that Monday, but the damage to trust and to shipping confidence was already done. War risk insurance premiums, which had already climbed from a baseline of roughly 0.1% of a ship's insured value up to as much as 0.4% before the ceasefire, spiked again, and multiple oil tankers that had been steaming toward the strait on the Omani route were tracked visibly turning back or diverting. Entirely, in the middle of that same chaotic stretch, something happened in Dubai that deserves far more attention than it got. Residents across the city received an incoming missile alert on their phones, the first alert of its kind residents had received since the US and Iran reached their interim ceasefire the week before, and it was followed almost immediately by a second message telling them to disregard the previous warning, confirming it had been a false alarm. Now sit with the sequence of events here, because the order matters. A real drone had just struck a real cargo ship days earlier. Real airstrikes had just been exchanged between the US and Iran along the coast. And in the middle of all of that tension, an entire city of millions of people received a genuine missile warning on their phones, only to be told minutes later that it was a mistake. That is not the behavior of a region that trusts the ceasefire is holding. A false alarm doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because early warning systems are primed, on edge, and scanning for exactly the kind of attack everyone half expects is coming. Shortly after the alert went out, the Way's government released details of a phone call between its foreign minister, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi, in which the Way side stressed the importance of full commitment to the terms of the US-Iran memorandum. That's diplomatic language for, please everyone calm down before someone makes a mistake, nobody can walk back. Here's a piece of this story that almost never makes it into the headlines, and it might be the most important part of the entire picture. A detailed analysis by the New York Times, comparing the value and volume of oil and fuel shipments from the start of the war through early May against the same period a year earlier, found something that should reshape how you think about who this conflict actually benefits. The biggest winners from the disruption weren't in the Middle East at all. The United States saw roughly $50 billion in increased export revenue, while Russia, which kept its own exports steady throughout the crisis, picked up more than $15 billion in additional revenue of its own, with other non-Gulf oil exporters capturing smaller gains as buyers scrambled for alternative supply. Meanwhile, every single Persian Gulf nation saw its own exports decline. The ones that had some way around the strait, Saudi Arabia through its pipeline network to the Red Sea, and Oman simply by virtue of its geography sitting outside the choke point, still managed to see revenue increases despite the disruption. But Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, nations with no real alternative route for their exports, all saw their revenues fall. Iran itself, interestingly, saw a revenue increase because even in the chaos it created, it retained privileged access to the strait that its Gulf neighbors didn't have. Think about what that means for incentives going forward. Every nation involved in this crisis, except the ones being squeezed hardest by it, has some financial reason not to rush toward a full resolution. The United States is capturing market share it wouldn't otherwise have. Russia is quietly profiting from a crisis it had nothing to do with starting. And Iran, even while threatening tolls and firing drones at commercial vessels, is still managing to extract more value from the strait than it did before the war, purely because it controls access to it. That's not a coincidence, and it's not going to resolve itself just because both sides sign another memorandum. As long as disruption is more profitable than normalcy for at least some of the major players, disruption has a built-in reason to continue. While all of this was happening on the water, a much slower, much quieter fight was playing out in diplomatic chambers around the world over who even gets to weigh in on the strait's future. In April, China and Russia vetoed a Bahraini drafted resolution that called for an end to Iranian attacks on shipping and coordinated international efforts, including potential ship escorts, to protect vessels transiting the waterway. The United Kingdom and the United States both backed that resolution. China and Russia blocked it, with Beijing framing freedom of navigation in the strait as something the international community should collectively guarantee rather than something any single coalition should enforce militarily. The U.S. has since said it's drafting a narrower resolution with input from Gulf Arab states, and France has separately said it's preparing its own resolution aimed at establishing an international mission to restore free movement through the strait. As of now, neither has actually been scheduled for a vote, on the ground or rather on the water. The more consequential move has come from the U.S. Navy directly. In late June, a maritime body overseen by the Navy, the Joint Maritime Information Center, announced it was widening a shipping route through the strait near the Omani coastline, allowing increased traffic in both directions. This wasn't just a logistics decision. Analysts described it explicitly as a challenge to Iran's claimed control over the waterway, a way of signaling to shipping companies and to Tehran simultaneously that there are now two competing systems for how to move through Hormuz, Iran's route, which hugs its own coastline and requires ships to effectively ask Tehran's permission, and an American-backed route along the Omani coast that doesn't. Iran's response has been consistent and blunt. Its foreign minister has warned that any attempt to establish separate arrangements outside what Iran considers the agreed framework will only increase tensions and delay the strait's full reopening, while Iran's Revolutionary Guard has said openly that it is taking measures to control traffic through the waterway and will deal with vessels that violate its preferred routes more firmly than it has so far. The United Kingdom, meanwhile, hosted a 50-country conference back in April specifically focused on a plan to reopen the strait and separately deployed drones, fighter jets, and a Royal Navy warship as part of an international mission aimed at securing commercial shipping, an unmistakable signal that London, at least, isn't willing to leave this entirely to Washington and Tehran to sort out between themselves. So where does diplomacy sit right now, heading into July? The honest answer is fragile and running out of runway faster than most people realize. The 60-day negotiating window built into the June 17th memorandum started ticking the moment it was signed, which means it's set to expire toward the end of August. A first round of broader talks aimed at hammering out a final agreement wrapped up in Switzerland, with mediators describing what they called encouraging progress, but by their own admission, major sticking points remain completely unresolved, chief among them Iran's nuclear program, the exact timeline for sanctions relief, and of course, what happens to shipping fees and route control once the current 60-day free transit period runs out. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said publicly that the full restoration of normal maritime traffic through the strait is, in his words, Iran's responsibility, a phrase that sounds cooperative on the surface but functionally means Iran still considers itself the party in charge of deciding when and how normal shipping actually resumes. There's also real skepticism from people who study this region for a living about whether Iran ever intends to fully let go of the leverage it's built here. A security analyst at the risk consultancy SRM told Newsweek bluntly that it's unlikely Iran will give up this strategic advantage voluntarily, and a retired US Navy Vice Admiral Robert Morit made a similarly blunt point. Given the sheer volume of vessels that need to pass through this waterway every single day, there simply isn't a military solution that keeps the strait reliably open long term. At some point, in his words, there has to be an actual diplomatic agreement with Iran, not just another temporary ceasefire patched together after the last near miss, and that diplomatic path is genuinely complicated by internal Iranian politics as much as by external pressure. Iran's parliament still needs to formally ratify the broader memorandum, and hardline voices inside the government have reportedly conditioned further cooperation on guarantees around sanctions, relief, and continued Hormuz access that the American side may not be able to deliver without separate congressional approval, an entirely different layer of political friction sitting underneath the ceasefire itself. Perhaps the most sobering assessment of all doesn't come from either side of the negotiating table. It comes from the region's own state-owned oil infrastructure. The United Arab Emirates State Oil Company has estimated that even in the best-case scenario, even if a final deal gets signed relatively quickly, full shipping flows through the Strait of Hormuz are unlikely to return to anything resembling pre-war levels until sometime in 2027. Not next month, not by the end of this 60-day window. Sometime next year at the earliest, according to the people who actually operate tankers through these waters for a living. That single estimate tells you more about the real state of this crisis than any press conference from Washington or Tehran, because it's coming from an entity with every financial incentive to want the strait open again as fast as humanly possible, and even they don't believe that's realistic anytime soon. So here's what I want you to walk away with, because it's not what most of the coverage of this story is actually asking. The question isn't whether Iran has the military strength to defeat the United States Navy in the Strait of Hormuz, because everyone, including Tehran, already knows the answer to that. Iran doesn't have that strength, and it isn't pretending to. The real question is whether military strength is even the thing that determines control of this waterway anymore. Iran has figured out something that doesn't require winning a single naval engagement. It has figured out how to make the strait expensive, uncertain, and dependent on its goodwill, using nothing but mines that may or may not get cleared depending on who's allowed to clear them, fees that may or may not apply depending on whose negotiating team you believe on any given day, a tiered access system that turns passage into a diplomatic favor rather than a legal right, and a willingness to fire drones at commercial ships the moment it feels its authority over the water is being tested. Every one of those tools costs Iran almost nothing to deploy, and every one of them raises the cost of doing business in a corridor that the entire global economy still depends on for a fifth of its oil and gas. That's the picture forming underneath every individual headline about traffic numbers or transit fees or diplomatic statements. Washington has aircraft carriers. It has the Fifth Fleet. It has the ability to widen shipping lanes and escort tankers and strike missile sites whenever Iran crosses a line. What it does not have, at least not yet, is the ability to make every insurance underwriter in London, every shipping executive in Singapore, and every government from Muscat to Brussels stop asking Tehran for permission first. And until that changes, the ships steaming past Hormuz aren't just carrying oil. They're carrying a running referendum on who actually controls the most important choke point in the world economy, one nervous, overpriced, insurance-padded voyage at a time. Watch what comes out of the next round of talks, if Iran walks away from that table still holding both the fee structure and the demining contract. This conversation stops being about a ceasefire. It becomes a conversation about ownership, and that's a conversation nobody in Washington seems ready to have yet.